My daughter's teacher closed the classroom door and asked why my mother kept calling CPS, saying I locked my kids in closets, and I didn't move. I just stood there with my hand still on the door handle, and I couldn't feel my legs. She was looking at me with this careful, gentle face, and I realized she was waiting for me to explain something I didn't even know had happened. I said what, and it came out weird, too high, and she repeated it slower, like maybe I hadn't understood, and said my mother had been contacting the school and CPS as a concerned grandmother, and that CPS had already reached out to the principal. That's why I was hearing it from her first, before any formal notice arrived. I still couldn't process it, and I kept thinking she'd made a mistake, that she meant someone else's mother, someone else's kids. But then she said my mother's name, Carol, and I just stood there trying to make that make sense. I'm a single mother and I have 2 kids. My daughter was 9 then, and my son was 6, and their father died of cancer when my youngest was still a baby, so it's been the 3 of us for years. We have routines, dinner at 6 and homework at the table and bedtime stories. Nothing fancy, just normal life. The kind where you're tired all the time but everything mostly works. My mother never thought it was enough, and she'd show up unannounced and walk through my house like she was inspecting it, opening cabinets and checking the fridge. And she'd say I looked tired or that the kids needed more than one parent, and I'd just wait for her to leave. After I started dating again, maybe a year after my husband died, she got colder and stopped calling as much, and when she did, her voice had this tight edge. I thought she was just being judgmental, but I didn't think she was doing this. Mrs. Alvarez sat down in one of those tiny plastic chairs and folded her hands on the desk and said Carol had contacted them multiple times and that CPS was doing collateral interviews with the school as part of their process. She said they hadn't seen anything concerning in my daughter's behavior, but they were required to cooperate. I asked what my mother had said exactly, and Mrs. Alvarez hesitated, then said Carol claimed I was locking the kids in closets as punishment and that they were afraid of me. I actually laughed. This awful sharp sound that didn't feel like it came from me. And Mrs. Alvarez looked softer somehow and said quickly that she didn't believe it but that the system had to follow through. I nodded, but I wasn't really hearing her anymore because I was trying to think if I'd done anything that could look like that. I'd sent my daughter to her room a few times when she had tantrums, and I'd told my son to stay in timeout until he calmed down. Normal things. But standing there in that classroom, I started replaying it all and wondering if I'd been harsher than I remembered, if grief and exhaustion had made me someone I didn't recognize. What if I had been too strict, and what if I'd yelled more than I thought, and what if my mother had seen something I couldn't see in myself? I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat, and everything felt too bright and too loud, and I tried to remember the last time I'd punished my son. 2 weeks ago maybe, or 3, when he'd thrown a toy at his sister and I'd made him sit on the stairs for 5 minutes. Was that what she meant, and could that be twisted into something else? Then I thought about this morning, my daughter brushing her teeth while I made lunches and my son asking if he could bring his dinosaur to school, and the way they fought over who got to pick the bedtime story last night. It was normal, and it was fine, but maybe normal didn't matter if someone was determined to make it look like something else. I sat there for a long time trying to figure out when my mother had decided to do this, and I couldn't find the moment. Or maybe it had always been building, and I just hadn't wanted to see it. That night, I made spaghetti, and we ate dinner like usual, and I kept watching my kids, trying to see what my mother saw that made her think she needed to call say peace. My daughter talked about her friend's birthday party, and my son spilled juice on his shirt, and cried a little, then forgot about it, and they were just kids, they were fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that fine wasn't going to be enough. CPS showed up 3 days later, and I was folding laundry in the living room when the doorbell rang, and when I saw the woman standing there with a clipboard and a badge, my hands went numb. She said her name and asked if she could come in, and I said yes immediately because I'd read enough online to know that hesitating makes you look guilty. She walked through the house slowly, opening closets and checking the kids' rooms, and she looked at the beds and the toys and the clothes and drawers, but didn't say anything, just made notes on her clipboard, and I followed her around like I was watching myself from somewhere else. She asked if she could speak to my children separately, and I said yes, even though the idea made my chest tight, and my daughter went first. They talked in her room with the door closed for maybe 15 minutes, and I sat on the couch trying not to think about what was being asked. And when my daughter came out, she looked confused but not upset, and asked if she was in trouble. And I said no, everything's fine. My son went next, and he went willingly, holding his stuffed bear, and I heard his voice through the door, high and chatty, and he was probably telling her about dinosaurs because he tells everyone about dinosaurs. When it was over, the caseworker came back to the living room, and made more notes and said the children seemed healthy and well-adjusted, and that the home environment appeared appropriate. She didn't smile, but her tone softened a little, and she said the case would remain open while they completed their review, and that someone might follow up, and then she left. I closed the door and just stood there, and my daughter asked if everything was okay, and I said yes, but I didn't know if that was true. After they went to bed, I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I couldn't stop shaking, not from guilt but from how powerless it felt. Like someone had lied about me, and now I had to wait for strangers to decide if I was allowed to keep my own children. I told myself it would be fine because the caseworker had said the kids seemed fine, and the house was fine, and I'd cooperated, and that had to count for something. For about 2 days I actually believed that, and I thought maybe this was almost over, that CPS would close the case and my mother would finally back off, and I even felt a little relieved, like maybe the system seeing there was nothing wrong would prove something to. Then Carol showed up. It was late afternoon, and I was helping my son with a puzzle on the living room floor when I heard shouting outside, and I looked out the window and saw my mother standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, yelling loud enough that I could hear her through the glass. She was saying I was imprisoning her grandchildren, and that someone needed to stop me and that she wasn't going to let this continue. I went outside and she turned on me immediately, saying I had no right to keep the kids from her, and that she knew what I was doing, and that everyone would see the truth eventually. I told her to leave and she got louder, and a neighbor across the street came out onto their porch and just stood there watching. I went back inside and locked the door, and my daughter was standing in the hallway, and I told her it was okay, that Grandma was just upset and needed to calm down, but she asked why Grandma was so mad, and I didn't know what to say that wouldn't make it worse. Carol didn't leave, and she stayed out there yelling for maybe 10 more minutes, and then I heard a car pull up, and it was the police because the neighbor had called them. I watched from the window as 2 officers got out and talked to Carol first, and she was gesturing toward my house, her hands moving fast, and then one of the officers came to my door. I explained as calmly as I could and told him about the CPS report and the accusations and how she'd been escalating, and he took notes and asked if I had documentation, and I said CPS had been here and the school could confirm what had been reported. The other officer was still talking to Carol, and I could see her getting more worked up, and finally they walked her back to her car and spoke to her for a long time. When they came back to my door, the first officer said they'd issued her a formal warning to stop harassing me, and that if she came back I should call them immediately, and he said they'd be documenting this. After they left, I sat down on the couch and my daughter climbed up next to me and asked if Grandma was going to come back, and I said no, but I wasn't sure I believed it, and I didn't know if the police report would help or make everything worse. The next few weeks were just waiting, and I kept expecting another visit from CPS, or another scene from Carol, or some new accusation to surface. My daughter started asking more questions, and she wanted to know why we didn't see Grandma anymore, and why she'd been so angry, and if it was because of something she did. And I told her it wasn't her fault, that grown-ups sometimes have problems, but I could see she wasn't convinced. At school, I started noticing the other parents looking at me differently, not obviously, but just these quick glances when I dropped my daughter off, and conversations that paused when I walked by. I didn't know if Carol had been talking to people, or if it was just my paranoia making me see things that weren't there, but either way it made everything heavier. I thought about asking Mrs. Alvarez if she'd heard anything, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I just smiled and acted normal and hated every second of it. CPS called again about 2 weeks later, and it was the same caseworker, and she said they were closing the case as unfounded and that their review found no evidence to support the allegations. She said signs of bad faith reporting had been documented, and that if further reports came in from the same source, they'd be flagged. And her tone was still neutral, but there was something almost apologetic in the way she said it. I thanked her, and after I hung up, I sat on the couch and cried for the first time since this whole thing started. Not from relief exactly, but more from how exhausting it had been to hold everything in. I thought that would be the end of it because the case was closed and the police had warned her, and I thought she'd finally leave us alone, but she didn't. She started showing up places, not at my house, but at the grocery store, and at the park, and at the school pickup line, and she didn't approach me directly. She'd just stand where I could see her, watching. Once she walked past my car in the parking lot and stared right at me through the window, and I felt my stomach drop, even though she didn't say anything. My daughter noticed and asked why Grandma kept showing up but didn't talk to us, and I didn't know how to explain it, so I told her Grandma was going through something and that we needed to give her space, which felt like a lie, but also the only thing I could say. I started documenting everything, and I took photos when I saw her car parked near the school, And I wrote down dates and times, and I kept the police report from the incident at my house. A friend who worked as a paralegal told me I should consider a restraining order, and I resisted at first because it felt extreme, but then Carol sent a letter. It came in the mail, handwritten and pages long, and she said I was unfit, and that my husband would be ashamed of me, and that she was going to keep fighting until the kids were safe. She said she'd been documenting everything too, and that eventually, people would see the truth. And the whole thing had this calm, rational tone that made it worse, like she genuinely believed she was the reasonable one. I read it twice, then put it down and just stared at the wall for a while, and part of me wanted to respond, to defend myself, to explain. But another part of me knew there was no point because she wasn't going to hear it. I took the letter to the police station and asked what I could do, and the officer I spoke to reviewed everything I'd brought, the CPS closure and the warning they'd issued and the letter and the pattern of showing up. He said I had enough for a restraining order and that I should file as soon as possible, so I did. But the process wasn't fast, and the waiting was worse than I expected. Filling out the restraining order paperwork felt surreal, because there were all these boxes to check and statements to write, and I kept second-guessing myself, wondering if I was overreacting, if I should just try one more time to talk to her. Then I'd remember her standing on my lawn screaming, and I'd keep writing. I had to submit evidence, copies of the CPS closure and the police report and the letter and photos of her car near the school, and I organized it all in a folder. Looking at it laid out like that made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Like this was actually happening, and I was taking my own mother to court. The court date was set for 3 weeks out, and Carol was notified, and I spent those weeks expecting her to escalate, to show up at my house again, to do something, but she didn't. She stayed quiet, and somehow that felt worse, like she was waiting. I know. I hired a lawyer through a legal aid referral, a woman named Sarah who charged a flat fee and told me the process would be straightforward. She said the judge would review the evidence and ask questions, and likely issue a temporary order that day. And she said Carol could contest it, but given the CPS findings and the police involvement, it was unlikely to go in her favor. I wanted to believe her, but I kept thinking about all the ways it could go wrong. Like, what if the judge didn't think it was serious enough? Or what if Carol's lawyer was better? Or what if I said something wrong and undermined my own case? The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep, and I kept replaying what I was going to say, trying to make it sound calm and reasonable, because I didn't want to seem emotional or vindictive. I just wanted to sound like someone who wanted to protect her kids. The courthouse was smaller than I expected and colder, and I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with my folder, and my hands were shaking so badly, I had to hold them between my knees. Sarah sat next to me and went over what would happen, but I wasn't really absorbing it. I just kept staring at the floor. Carol arrived about 10 minutes before we were called in, and she was dressed neatly with her hair done, and she looked calm, and she didn't look at me, just sat on the opposite side of the hallway with a man I didn't recognize, maybe a lawyer or a friend, and they spoke quietly. I tried not to stare, but I kept glancing over, and part of me still couldn't believe this was real, that we were here, that it had come to this. When they called us in, the courtroom felt too big and too empty, and the judge had reading glasses and this tired look, like he'd heard versions of this story 100 times. He asked me to state my case, and I did, and I explained the CPS report and the false accusations and the confrontation at my house and the police warning and the letter and the pattern of showing up. My voice shook, and I hated it, but I got through it. The judge reviewed the documents, and he read the CPS closure report and the police report and the letter Carol had sent, and he didn't say anything for a while, just turned pages and made notes, and I sat there trying not to hold my breath. Then he asked Carol if she had a response, and she stood and said she'd only been trying to protect her grandchildren, that I was overwhelmed, and she'd been worried, and her intentions were good. Her voice was steady, almost warm, and for a second I wondered if he'd believe her, if everything I'd brought wouldn't be enough. The judge asked her why she'd continued to contact the school and make reports after CPS had closed the case, and she hesitated, and her lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her. She said she didn't think the investigation had been thorough enough, and that she still had concerns. The judge looked at the papers again and said bad faith reporting to CPS is taken seriously, and that the pattern of behavior documented here suggested harassment, not genuine concern. He said he was granting a 2-year no-contact order, and that Carol couldn't contact me or my children, or come within 500 feet of our home or their school, and if she violated it, she'd face criminal charges. Carol went still, but she didn't say anything, and the judge dismissed us. I walked out of the courtroom feeling like I might collapse, and Sarah touched my arm and said it went as well as it could have, and that I should keep documenting everything just in case. I nodded, but I couldn't really process what she was saying. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a while because my kids were at a friend's house, and I was alone, and I just sat there staring at the steering wheel, waiting to feel relieved, but I didn't. I just felt tired. The first few weeks after the restraining order were fragile, and I kept waiting for Carol to show up anyway, to test it, to push the boundary, but she didn't. Her car stopped appearing near the school, and the grocery store trips went back to normal, and slowly the tension in my chest started to ease, but it didn't go away completely. My daughter asked once if Grandma was coming back, and I told her not right now, and she seemed okay with that, like she'd already started moving on. My son didn't ask at all because he'd been so young when everything happened that her absence didn't seem to register. But I couldn't move on that easily, and I'd be at the park with the kids and see an older woman with gray hair, and my whole body would tense before I realized it wasn't her. I'd check the rearview mirror too often while driving, and I'd wake up at night convinced I'd heard a car in the driveway. And then there was this other thing I didn't expect, where I resented the kids sometimes, not for anything they did, but for needing reassurance I didn't have. My daughter would ask if we were safe, and I'd say yes, and I'd feel this flash of anger that I had to keep saying it, that I couldn't just be done with all of this. That made me feel worse than anything Carol had done. Honestly, the fact that I was mad at my own kids for being scared. I never said it out loud, but I just felt it, and then felt guilty for feeling it. The school stayed supportive, and Mrs. Alvarez would check in occasionally, asking how we were doing, and I appreciated it, but I also hated that it was necessary. A few other parents reached out after they heard what had happened, and some were genuinely kind, but others just seemed curious, like they wanted the story, so I kept my distance from all of them. About a year in, I started dating again, the same man I'd been seeing when all of this started, and he'd backed off during the CPS investigation, giving me space, but we'd stayed in touch. When things settled, we picked it back up, and my kids liked him, and he was patient and didn't try to be their father, just existed alongside us. Carol would have hated that, and part of me thinks that's what started all of this in the first place. The idea that I was moving on, and that I didn't need her, and that my life was continuing without her permission. I don't know. I stopped trying to make sense of her reasoning. As the 2-year mark got closer, I felt the anxiety creep back, and I didn't know if Carol would reach out when the restraining order expired, if she'd try to apologize, if she'd start the whole thing over again. I told myself I'd handle it if it happened, but I didn't know what that would actually look like. When the restraining order expired, Carol sent a letter, not to my house, but to my lawyer's office, and I guess that was her way of staying technically compliant. The letter was short, and she said she'd had time to reflect, and that she wanted to start over, and that she hoped we could rebuild a relationship for the sake of the children. I read it twice, then put it in a drawer, and didn't respond. Maybe that makes me petty, or maybe it makes me unforgiving, but I thought about my daughter's teacher closing that classroom door, and I thought about sitting on the kitchen floor after CPS left, and I thought about Carol shouting on my lawn while my kids watched through the window. I thought about the months of looking over my shoulder, and about explaining to my daughter why Grandma was so angry, and about my son flinching when someone raises their voice, and I just couldn't. My kids are older now, and they're doing well. My daughter plays soccer and gets good grades, and my son builds elaborate Lego structures and tells me about his day. They barely remember Carol, and when they mention her, it's casual, like she's someone they used to know a long time ago. The thing that still sits with me is that the threat didn't come from a stranger. It came from family, from someone who was supposed to love my kids, and who claimed she was protecting them, and who believed her own story so completely that she couldn't see what she was actually doing. I don't think she ever will. I haven't heard from Carol since that letter, and I don't know if she's still in the area, and I don't know if she tells people her version of the story. I don't think about her as much as I used to, and when I do, it's less anger and more just tired sadness. My kids are safe, and our life is quiet, and we have routines, nothing fancy, but it works, and that's still all I'm trying to do. And no one's trying to stop me anymore. Thank you for listening. And if you've been through something similar, I hope you know you're not alone. If you want to hear more stories like this, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe because I upload every single day, and take care.